And hello, everybody out there. Just waiting for a few seconds to make sure it kind of kicks in on all the different platforms. It takes a few seconds. That's why they have intro music on the real professional broadcasts. I have yet to do the intro music, but this is David Rovix with another episode of Discussions with David, which comes to you in one form or another, usually 2 or 3 times a week in some form on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, where we talk with interesting people. And then it goes up as a podcast afterwards. And you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. If you look for This Week with David Rovix, and you can find the video archive of the discussions if you look for the Discussions with David playlist, if you go to youtube.com/drovix, or any number of other places. Today, we're spending the hour with Assistant Professor of Sociology at George Mason University, Dr. Ben Manski, who I have known for quite a long time, since he was a student activist in Wisconsin a very long time ago. And now he's a professor, and he has been a lawyer for many years and has founded many different organizations that you may or may not have heard of, but which have had a real impact on the discourse and even on economic policies in this country and around the world. And bringing onto the screen Dr. Ben Manski. Great to have you with me.
Good to see you, Brother Rovix.
And you have just recently put together this wonderful analysis with a couple other folks in the journal Socialism and Democracy, of an analysis of the global justice movement that we associate with the year 1999, but which actually began before then and went on for after that. But the millennial period of social movements that we shorthand call the global justice movement, and it's a wonderful analysis that I think is so important, which would have been my first question. I'm sort of answering it for myself, but like, why do an analysis like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you were to take it simply from a collective ego standpoint, those of us who are Gen Xers and millennials, and you grew up in the shadow of the 1960s, and many of us came up with stories of the civil rights movement, the student movement, the anti-war movement, the labor movement in that period. And it influenced our thinking for those of us who were teachers and activists and organizers, just socially conscious people. But there has been no kind of study of the 1990s through the 2000s as a formative period. So we could just say, hey, it's time for us to be the older folks. You were saying it was a long time ago, I think 25 years ago that you and I first met, to be sort of imposing our stories on younger people, whether they want to hear them, and oftentimes they do want to hear them, I find, as a teacher and a professor, or not, and we'll have to be cautious about that. So there's some of that. I think that's part of this. We want to tell those stories. We think there's something there, but then the question is, what is there? And the assumption about that really went into putting this special issue of socialism and democracy together was that there were lessons for activists from the 1990s through the 2000s and into the 2010s period that would be lessons that would be valuable to learn and learn from and sort of take into account today for organizers. And also that there was something to be learned for scholars from that period. That was a period in which we were in transition from sort of single issue to multi-issue politics in the 80s into a more synthetic politics by the end of the 1990s. That's really what we saw come out of Seattle. The idea of one struggle, one fight was becoming a reality by the late 1990s. That period of 1994 through 2014 in particular has some things to teach social movement scholars in the academy too. So that's what we were trying to do. I got a copy here. This is an academic journal, although there are lots of activists who are not academics who published in it. Back when I was never intending to go into academia long term, I got published in here. The editors saw something I'd written about the what I called the massacre in Miami, the brutal suppression of the mass protests at the free trade area of the Americas demonstrations in Miami in 2003.
2003, I was there, yeah.
Yeah. And another story that very few people remember, even among those who were there, we tend to forget about it. So I'd written that, but it is an academic journal, so it's got kind of a boring cover, but it's got some incredible text in here. And it's not just our introduction, which is quite long, but contributors to this issue include some academics, Sophia Aptekar, some organizers like Jeremy Brecker, Lisa Fithian, Bill Fletcher, and then I'll just read them off because some of these names may mean something to people. Shannon Gleason, Chris Hardneck, Walda Katz-Fishman, Hilary Lazar, myself, Seren Moudliar, who's the editor of Socialism and Democracy, among many other things, Marcel Parret, John Peck, Family Farm Defenders, Jerome Scott, League of Revolutionary Black Workers. I mean, I could give titles for all these people: Marina Citrin, Jackie Smith, Norm Stockwell, A.K. Thompson, Dominic Wetzel, and Leslie Wood. So who, like me, she made the transition earlier. She was a Love and Rage Anarchist Federation organizer in the 90s and is chair of the Department of Sociology at York. So it's a great collection of people, but also it's a really coherent, I think, picture you get of what a particular set of movements went through in this period.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it is, we should say also for the online audience, it is also online and in full, right? And on that, where Taylor and Francis Online is the link that you sent me, which is free to read these academic journals online, much as, of course, we'd like everybody to have a print copy as well. But it's, and that, when you mentioned the anarchist background of some of the principles of the global justice movement in terms of like organizing strategies, can you talk more about that, and the EZLN, the Zapatistas, and the sort of background of horizontal organizing? And that seems to be of the many lessons of the global justice movement and the things we can learn from the experience of the movement in reality. The organizing strategies, it seems to be like certainly one of those lessons.
One of the most influential sort of parts of what happened in terms of passing on lessons, for sure. The collection here and also our introduction is a collection that involves both theory and also insights from personal experience, but also empirical analysis. So I, Seren, and Hilary had each conducted interviews, well over 100 qualitative interviews, as they all are these days. Sorry, very tired, David, as you were commenting earlier. But in any event, so this study involves not only some engagement with theory, but with the experiences of lots of people who were, as they used to say in the 60s, their man, right? And so one thing that really comes out from those interviews is that consistently across the board, regardless of the sector of the larger movement that a person we were speaking with, a respondent, was coming from, they identified the Declaration of La Condon the emergence of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, as this incredibly influential sort of moment that sort of really opened up the 1990s for them, and so that's something that comes out in the study, right? But just to talk a little bit more about that, what we argue in our introduction is that there were really three sort of social movement turns of the 1990s into the 2000s.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Talk about that anarchist turn, democratic turn, and global turn is how you classify them.
Yeah, exactly. And we, there's some theorization of what a turn is. Some of the folks who were listening in and watching will have run into the sort of idea of a cultural turn before. So people talk about the postmodern turn, the structural turn, the post-structural turn, all these kinds of academic-y, hyper-intellectual sort of turns that happened, in our lifetimes for you.
It's a nice short word for an academic term. Yeah. It's very nice. I think only 4 letters.
Exactly. Yeah, but nobody's really defined what the heck a turn is. So that's one thing that we tried to do, and we said it's something that that social movements do too, right? That happens in movements, and that is actually something that activists try to achieve sometimes in movements. So basically, for us, a turn is a reconfiguration of movement practices, the things activists do, the things people in movements do, of framing of basically everything that goes into a social movement around sort of a new paradigm, a new central organizing idea. And so what we show is how there was a project of centering anarchist, anti-authoritarian principles and practices in the movements that went far beyond self-identified anarchists or anarchist organizations. There was a project around centering radical democracy, or just plain small d democracy, not only as a practice, but also as a goal, this idea that we actually had to work to achieve a more democratic society in this country. And there was also clearly a turn towards the global for popular movements in the United States in this period. And that not only were those projects, but they were actually successful projects. They were able to change the practices of people who didn't identify as radical Democrats, as what we used to call populists in the 1990s, progressive populists, people who didn't identify as anarchists, people who didn't identify as particularly focused on global justice, right? That all kinds of people beyond those immediate networks sort of took up horizontal organizing practices, ideas from all kinds of sources, some from history, some from the Zapatistas, some from each other, right? Columbus and Minneapolis talking to each other, et cetera, in the anarchist movement. And not only that, but also influenced the broader culture in the United States. So you look in the pop culture of the late 1990s into today, and you can see evidence of these three turns too.
And one of the influential aspects of embracing horizontal organizing, I think, as it was taking root in the movement, was that it worked, right? I mean, that's just one of the things that just struck me as somebody with, I mean, I guess in my youth, I was perfectly ready and happy to go in any left-wing direction as long as it might actually get the goods. And, and I didn't particularly care which one. And, in principle, I was more interested in the alleviating the suffering of the planet and the working class than in, a commitment to, particular ideas of which kinds of organizing was, sort of morally better. But it just seemed like, okay, it works. This was working, this horizontal organizing, way better than a lot of other things, sort of more hierarchical forms of organizing that I had seen people engage in that just didn't take off. And this was like taking off, and it went viral in a non-internet kind of, and on the internet. These ideas went viral on the internet. Probably they were some of the first ideas to go viral on the internet.
That's right. Yeah, and I don't think we there's an interview I did with Norman Stockwell, who's now the publisher of Progressive Magazine, and we talked about the media democracy movement in indie media. And one of the things that I think we both tried to bring forward in that interview, and he spoke to with so much authority from experience, from having been part of it, was that that the construction of the internet technologies, the BBSs, and then forums, and then sort of early precursors to online social networks and so on, were all projects of the left, right? So it wasn't, and of a particularly anti-authoritarian left, an anarchisty left, right? So as you were just pointing out, I think with your story about sort of how you gravitated towards and made, actually, let me back up. You weren't gravitating, you were making decisions, right? And so these turns were the result of conscious analysis and reflection on what works, what doesn't, where we've been. There were examples in the late 1980s into the 1990s that seemed to suggest hope. The Zapatista sort of model, various politics coming out of Europe as well here in the United States. Victorious uprisings that could only be characterized as democratic revolutions, all over the world. And those seem to suggest and some alternatives a lot of people decided to pick up, right? So absolutely, it's not that it was necessarily the case that you were going to become identified with the anarchist movement at that time, or any number of other people of our generation. It's that we made those decisions consciously, and we have to pay attention to why we made those decisions. Yeah.
In terms of, or I know I'm a bit jumping around here, but the problem with the hour format is that it's actually an hour. It just isn't very long, really. But would you say that there's a real sort of a continuous or real connected thread between organizing strategies of if we're going from the Zapatistas to the Seattle WTO and the global justice movement to the Wisconsin uprising, Occupy Wall Street, and the Arab uprising and Black Lives Matter? Can you connect all that in a pretty straightforward way? I'd say you could, but can you do that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, how would you connect it? Partially connected because there are a lot of the same people involved, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who are lifers.
Literally
the same people.
Yeah.
You know, Black Lives Matter in Ferguson. I mean, where did the Organization for Black Struggle come out of?
Yeah.
You know, Jamala Rogers. You know, I'm a bit of a Wisconsin I'm anti-nationalist, but I'm a bit of a Wisconsin nationalist as long as it's safe to be one. And as some people may know, and you know, there were more people per capita from Wisconsin than most other places in the United States in Seattle in 1999. There was a huge turnout in Seattle, and there's reasons for that. It had to do with the place of Wisconsin in the global movement. So, you know, is there a connection between what happened in Seattle and Wisconsin? There are hundreds of connections between Seattle and Wisconsin. And we can find evidence of that, not only in terms of tracking the activist biographies of all kinds of people, but there's all kinds of imagery we can pick up on. And some of that imagery, not audio imagery too, right? So this is what democracy looks like. A lot of us got kind of tired of that chant, but that was come up with on the streets of Seattle by an affinity group. I happen to know some of the people who were part of that affinity group. It spread through Seattle. It became the slogan, the chant of that period of the Seattle moment. And then it sort of got lost in the US for reasons that we can talk about if you want to, but it continued on in Australia, you know, other places you can find it getting picked up, rebounding around the world. And then the first place that it really returns to the United States in a big way is in Wisconsin in 2011, 10 years ago, this month, February, where a lot of people thought, hey, this is a new chant. But no, a lot of the newbies who came in. But no, that was directly from Seattle. Our good friend Ann Feeney, who just passed away, and I know you've talked about Ann quite a bit here. I like to, when I'm teaching about social movement continuity to my students, I will oftentimes stop the documentary, This Is What Democracy Looks Like, the great documentary about Seattle, and pause it where Ann is playing Have You Been to Jail for Justice? She's wearing a Wisconsin Earth Day to May Day t-shirt.
Yeah.
Playing that, you know, and so just, you know, there's direct continuities between, you know, the Zapatistas, the efforts the Zapatistas made to build ties across North America first and then into Europe. So, and I was part of that. I can just speak personally. I was a student in Portland, Oregon, where you are. And I think I had this shirt back then. It's my grandfather's shirt. So it's old, you know, but a friend of mine from Portland Peaceworks contacted me and said, there is a delegation coming from Chiapas in Mexico. I hadn't heard about this. And we ended up hosting a delegation from the EZLN 2 weeks after the uprising. They were consciously working to build the networks and the ties and so on. So there's a lot of, the long and the short of it, David, is that we could talk for hours just about all the different efforts that were made and the ways in which those efforts were successful to build sort of a broader understanding of the period in which we were sort of entering in the 1990s, this period of neoliberal global capitalist hegemony, right? And the ways in which those efforts were successful, and in ways, and as evidenced by any number of mass mobilizations across North America and here in the United States in particular over that period. You know, one thing I'll just footnote here is that, you know, it is commonly understood, I think, by activists and by social movement scholars who pay attention to this history, that that there was a bit of a disruption after 9/11. The IMF World Bank protests that were scheduled for the end of September in 2001, and I was one of the people on one of the two sort of major coordinating committees for that. Those were reoriented to become anti-invasion of Afghanistan protests. And there was a period in which we had a detour in terms of that particular sort of trajectory of movement building. But it wasn't permanently disrupted. It definitely returned with Wisconsin, with Occupy. It was reinforced with sort of an overlapping stream from the Day Without an Immigrant in 2006, which is, you know, has commonalities and also some different roots. but it's definitely part of the same overall period, the logics of global capitalism and what working poor people were dealing with in this time. And it went into Black Lives Matter. There's all kinds of evidence to that. And as much as the Occupy folks get taken down by all kinds of people and sometimes themselves, and I refer to them as them because we'd already done Occupy in Wisconsin, so we were always like, great, this is spreading. A lot of them went into supporting and helping to build Black Lives Matter, and there's all kinds of evidence of some of the good things that came out of that. Now, are we in the same period now is another question, right? And that's something we could talk about if you wanted to, but. Yeah.
Well, yes, I do. And so, are we in the same period now? Is that this is the is this? I mean, yeah, that is a very interesting question. Yeah, please. I mean, in terms of like these three categories of anarchist turn, democratic turn, and global turn, is that? I mean, has that? In terms of the sort of anarchist organizing turn, is that the question? If we're in the same, because I mean, it seems like with Black Lives Matter, it seems like, for example, the sort of horizontal organizing principles are very much seem to be all over the place, even though it is also an organization with leadership. It's very much a dispersed, decentralized movement as well.
Right. And so. The co-editors, meaning myself and Hillary Lazar, and then also Surin, the editor of the journal, we've really struggled with that question: are we in a new period or not? And if we are, we think it matters, right? So let me step back a little bit. I said earlier that the reason why this study matters is it may be important for us in terms of getting things. I won't say right, but being more successful in the 2020s in this decade that some of us are starting to call the decisive decade.
Sort of understanding what are the different trajectories here and where are we going here, like, and how are these different movements that have been going on over the past couple decades related, and are they? I mean, I was fascinated with talking with George Katsiafikas about these things, and I mean, his specialty has been on global movements over the past century or so, and how so many of them are related in ways that many people have no idea. Like so many of the different rebellions across Asia in the 1980s, like in between Burma, China, Korea, they're often just thought of as separate rebellions that are not related, and that's not accurate. But
I'm going to have to go back and listen to that conversation that you
fascinating interview. Yeah. And his books are fascinating too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm reminded of finding out that there was not one, but there were actually three former members of the Communist League who were Union generals in the Civil War. I found out recently that Garibaldi was offered, the commanding officer role for the Union Army. So yeah, there's all kinds of histories.
Wow. Garibaldi, the Italian.
That would make sense, wouldn't it? Yeah, it was.
Wow.
And then I found out about an uprising in Poland in 1863 with a Garibaldi. The red shirts from Italy were up there fighting for socialism, in Poland. So all kinds of histories we don't know about. But the importance there that I'm bringing forward, that you were bringing forward, is just that activists, generally speaking, are paying a lot of attention to what's going on in the world, where they're coming from, what the situation is now, where they think we're going, right? And that's why this question of periodization matters. Because activists are thinking about what are the times in which we live, right? Yeah. And we know that activists do that because, hey, they come out and put out statements from time to time saying, these are the times in which we live. A Declaration of Independence, a Declaration of Seneca Falls, a Port Huron statement. We could go on and on. There are all these sort of statements just from U.S. history, and there are many more globally. The Declaration of the Kondon Jungle, right? That are statements of the period. And those statements are statements not only about the times and sort of a set of issues, but they're about the logics of the period, how activists understand that, how they understand the emerging sort of relations of power in that period, and then what we need to do about it. I mean, heck, the Communist Manifesto was a classic example of that too, right? So that's what we center. We say this question of periodization matters because activists build movements based on our understandings of the times in which we live, and based on our expectations of the emergent relations of power, right?
Right, and one thing you talk about in here is the sort of the left moving further towards the left and the right moving further towards the right, and I don't know, is that?
Well, right, and so clearly, I mean, I think we make the case that there are a whole series of turns that are in full swing right now, right? So a socialist turn on the left, and I don't know if that means the left is more to the left, although there's sort of a communist subturn within the broader socialist turn, which I think is interesting. And then there's clearly a nationalist turn, right, on the right, and that is moving further to the right, for the right, no question about that. And so that suggests that there is a sense among activists that we are entering a new period, and yet at the same time, to get back to your original question that sort of set us off on this trail was. Even though we are moving into a new period, and I think we agree that we're in a new period now, right? With a new set of logics, in new class alliances, that are somewhat fragile, but seem to be present right now. That even though that's the case, that doesn't mean that all of the movement building activity and the struggles of the previous period disappear. History doesn't disappear, right? And one sense in which history doesn't disappear is that the practices, the culture, the people, the networks from the previous period are still here. So that matters because it is not uncommon for not only new activists to forget things they never knew in the first place, right? But for older activists to forget the things they knew as well, right? And so what we're saying is pay attention to the previous period, because a lot of the things that we do come out of that previous period. And there's more resources and know-how in the broader movement than we may be aware of. Like, let's take an inventory. Let's be aware of our capacity. And sometimes what can happen is that that movements are more successful than some within them believed was possible, right? Not everybody, right, but some. And they come into a moment in which they have an opportunity that they themselves have created. The Wisconsin uprising in 2011, a revolutionary situation, right? And they're not ready for it because they don't realize that they have the capacity that they collectively have, right? Mm-hmm. So going into the 2020s, if this is the decisive decade, let's recognize that we may be in a new period with new logics, and socialism as a thing and fascism as a thing, Back to the Future. Those are both things again, right? In real ways beyond, my hometown of Madison, Wisconsin, right? And Waukesha, Wisconsin, on the other end of the continuum there. But also we have more to use in this period to deploy, to take advantage of, than we might not be thinking of consciously.
I want to talk about where we're going and how things are different now. But one thing I want to ask about is that, which I run across a lot, is when you mentioned that a lot of people are interested in the past, and they're interested in past in terms of stories that people who are alive have to tell about what they've been doing, and also stories from history. And there's a lot of interest in those things for sure. But to the extent that there are people who are not interested, or who say, well, that's not relevant, because the argument that I hear most often, whether they're talking about the global justice movement of the 90s or the anti-war movement of the 60s or any number of other things, is they say, well, this is basically in a nutshell, to oversimplify what they say something along the lines of, this isn't relevant because you guys didn't win.
Yes. I haven't heard that directly, yet.
I'm oversimplifying the argument, but it's along those lines. So it's like, okay, well, if the anti-war movement was so great, why do we still have $700 billion a year military budget? That kind of thing.
I mean, my short answer about the question of winning, and it's oftentimes, when I hear it more commonly, I'm not denying what you're relating, and I certainly have run into people sometimes who seem to just not be very interested in anything that happened before they arrived on the scene. And I think I was probably like, I don't know, but I might have been like that at some points, and maybe not others when I was starting out. But anyway, putting that aside, oftentimes I hear people who are involved in some of these major uprisings, Wisconsin, Occupy, Black Lives Matter, immigrant rights campaigns, et cetera, say, we didn't win, why didn't we win, blah, blah, blah. I mean, my response is, if we had won, it would be over. I mean, this is not an easy thing. And you know, and that's my first response. I mean, come on. I mean, for the Wisconsin uprising to have won, just that, it would have required, you know, a political revolution in the United States. We weren't going to win without it, and it did grow, right? In a sense, right? So there's that. The other thing is that we actually won a lot of things that people are not aware of. I mean, even in the Wisconsin uprising, there's a focus on the anti-public sector union elements of Act 10 that was were central for a lot of people. But what is not that, you know, what gets lost is that there were attempts to destroy them. I mean, all kinds of things. To destroy the microbrewing industry in Wisconsin. You know, the big brewers had provisions in there to put all the, you know, hundreds of microbreweries out of business. They wanted to spin the UW-Madison off from the University of Wisconsin system. And there are a whole series of things like that were won. And, you know, the struggle continues in Wisconsin to this day. So it's not only is it not over, but in some respects, I'd say we have more capacity to win the big fight, the one that really matters, than we did before. And now, yeah, it's fine. It's up to them and it's up to us. We have a few years and the 2020s to get this off on the right footing and to finish the job in the next 9 years at the end of this decade. And if we don't, then nobody's going to be asking, you know, why didn't you win? Because they're just, you know, we're going to be dealing with levels of hardship in broader sectors of the world, right? Including here in the States, in particular, that where those won't be the questions they're asking. But I think we have the capacity to win, and I didn't think that that's important to recognize. Nobody thought we had the capacity to win in the beginning of the 1990s, the big fight.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in terms of the movement in the 1990s, and when we talk about the global justice movement and the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank, and I mean, even though today the stratification of wealth in the world continues to grow, I believe, and that also continues to grow in the United States, but at the same time, those movements changed the conversation globally and had a real impact on IMF policies towards many countries and influence many countries in terms of how they dealt with the IMF. I mean, it'd be hard to overstate what impact the movement had, even though actually we're still losing, like as a class. The global working class is still losing, if you want to put it that way. The 99% is still losing, but these strategies have had lots of partial victories, lots of battles won in the overall war that may be losing, if we're going to use that tired allegory. But I mean, you know, it just seems to me that if we look at the picture in a little more detail, we see so many victories, so many battles won in so many different cases where there have been struggles. It's just that when you look at the overall tendency, you know, it's pretty negative in terms of the control of the capitalists and the imperialists of the planet, you know, at the moment, and the future of humanity. But what about that? What about the socialism fascism question? Is that the question of the decade, or what is the new contradiction as you see it? And as I mean, you see the movement, or you see that things are changing in terms of the what is this movement? Are we still in those times? Are we in new times? What are the new times we're in? What are these different alliances that you see that you're talking about happening?
Right. I mean, I think this is where we start to get into sort of my sense of things as an activist and who's paying attention rather than anything where I have engaged in intensive study to get a sense of what lots of other people think and what their understandings are. So you know, what I would say, first of all, is that, the wheel is still in spin, I think. And it's a little hard to get a sense on, when I said there's these tenuous sort of realignments, it's a little hard to get a sense of how that's going to play out. I mean, there are things that for me are still hard for me to adjust to, in the way in which I imagine that veterans of the 60s had a hard time adjusting to the 90s, and veterans of the 30s had a hard time adjusting to the 60s. I'm having a hard time adjusting to the fact that there is a wing of the Democratic Party that, when I think about them, I regard them to be allies, right? And I recognize that they have some institutional power. And of course, there was always a progressive and even a DSA section in Congress, right? Let's not sort of obliterate that history or just obfuscate it or what have you, just forget it. But there are things that I have not supported in the past and don't actually still support strategically that seem to be having more success than I would have expected, right? So I'm just saying that to point out that that in a period like this where seem to be shifting from one, we're sort of we're in it's an intermezzo, right, or whatever. It's an interim period, right? It can be kind of hard to get a grasp on things. I don't think socialism versus nationalism is going to be the final play here, and anarchism is showing a little bit of a comeback, and I think as you may know, for me, sort of democracy is a central theme for a central paradigm. The central paradigm of the left, has always been sort of the way I saw things, right? And you certainly see the language of radical democracy still in the picture now too. So in terms of directions in the next couple of years, right? I think that you're going to see a movement towards the global that we had, like when you talk about the global justice movement, and when we reference the global turn in here, we moved away from that quite a while ago. We've had these global waves, but we haven't been organizing on a global basis in the same way that we were in the late 90s into the early 2000s. In some time, you see a lot of sort of cross-border transnational connections. Transnational social movements are a thing. But in terms of a transnational project, right, that seems like it might be about to reemerge, right? Mm-hmm. You look at the global climate crisis, you look at the global nationalist turn. You look at, the fact that the left has always been global throughout its entire history as well. You really have, three positions. You have the nationalist right, you have the socialist, democratic, anti-authoritarian left, right? And then you have global capital and its version of liberalism, right? And I think those have been sort of the larger sort of positions that have been in from which people have been moving for a while. But I think it's going to become much clearer in the next couple of years. And to make it more clear for myself and maybe for anybody who's paying attention right now, I think that what it will happen with popular movements, and is happening right now, but will become sort of more evident in the next year or two, is that there will be a global project for popular movements, for the broader sort of democratic current for true democracy, that will become something that people really identify with and invest time in and make demands of and for, right? So we need a new global order, and it needs to work for all of us. And that's a matter of necessity.
I'm just to be really cynical. As soon as we have that kind of global movement for the new order for the environment, I can just easily imagine somebody like President Biden launching an invasion of Brazil for environmental reasons. Mm. I mean, but because I'm just thinking of, and that's just a random example of the kind of weird things that could happen. Not anything specific about anything geopolitical, but I mean, because I'm just thinking of 2001 and what about the global justice movement and its the pros and cons in terms of its ability to cope with the kinds of things that happen. I mean, it just seems like the nationalism was used very successfully as a divisive tool by the ruling class from 2001 onwards in many ways to the present. I mean, it was opposed and has been opposed very eloquently and on a widespread basis as well, but it's also taken root in many ways that the sort of nationalist or the I guess at least it seems to me like the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan kind of had an impact to break up this kind of international this direction towards an international movement. Do you think, or 9/11 had that kind of impact?
I mean, the so-called, I have trouble with the framing of the global justice movement, because there clearly was a global justice movement, but that's not all that the global turn was, right? Because it was a global anti-capitalist movement, and it was a global democracy movement, and the global justice framing, I think, is too limited, and it doesn't account for the agency and the interests of working and poor people all over the world, right? And also with the sophistication of people who say, hey, we can't allow them to govern us anymore, which is a different question than, it's a inextricably related question, but it's not the same question as the global justice question. So, but that said, clearly the global justice movement in most parts of the world went directly into the global anti-war movement. And that's why we had a global anti-war movement with 25,000 people in the streets of DC 2 weeks after 9/11, and some of the largest global protests in world history against the U.S. and allied invasions and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think there was a step backwards in terms of clarity, right? And so we could talk about that further, but I think because we have limited time, I want to sort of return to the question about moving forward, because I think you were bringing it up to say, how do we avoid getting derailed, right? Yeah. And I think that is a central question, and you could tell I was having a little bit of difficulty formulating my thoughts as I was talking earlier, but I guess I tend to think that necessity does, necessity is constructed. Activists get a sense of necessity based on their existing understanding of the world, right? But we have a lot of common understandings now around the world about, how capitalism works, right? So I think we probably have some common senses of necessity. I think there are certainly hundreds of millions of people across the world who agree that there is just an incredible sense of urgency to fix the whole problem, right? Soon. And that's climate, that's white supremacy, that's the fact that we are engaged in as I said, there are three positions, and there are three counter movements, right? There are movements and counter movements. There's a movement of global capital and neoliberalism. There's the movement of white supremacy and nationalism. There's the movement of socialism and democracy and anti-authoritarianism, right? And so these are movements that are all counter movements to each other, and we regard each other to be threats, right? So the question is, if I feel that sense of necessity, that we have to get it right, because of the climate crisis, because of the immiseration of working and poor people that we can't accept any longer, and the Biden administration better watch out, because they're running out of time right now. They've been they had a few weeks in which people were sort of waiting to see what would happen. I don't think they're going to get into April without seeing some mass response in this country. So, but the point is, I think that sense of necessity is going to force lots of us to get serious about the global project. And we need, how should the world be governed? What are we going to do about the climate crisis, right? What are we going to do? What are we going to do to make sure that we're the ones who decide collectively, right?
One of the things about these, about the horizontal organized movements, particularly around the WTO and around Occupy Wall Street, that I thought resonated especially, was that they happened during Democratic administration. So it was clearly not a movement, hidden, veiled movement of Democrats, as is often, sort of appears to be the case, at least when there's a Republican in the White House. Like, oh, it's just the Democrats marching against.
Right, and I think that when I was saying, let's move away from the question of sort of where did the anti-war movement go right and wrong. I mean, part of it was that there you did have this alliance where the Democrats were on board. So in terms of those three poles or those three movements and counter movements, the liberals were aligned with the right at the beginning, right? And then they repositioned, and a lot of us were working to reposition them, right? And then they're aligned with us. But where does that actually take us when they come into power, right? And so, it's there can be all kinds of different consequences depending on what the configuration of movements and counter movements are, right? And what
how have things been changed by actions like Trump pulling out of the TTIP and and TPP? I mean, this was a goal of well, I sang at lots of protests about against the TPP and TIP, and then Trump came into power and pulled the U.S. out, which was just like kind of like, you know, I just didn't even know what to think or what to do, but it was like, okay, I guess that was sort of a victory. Not
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was sort of, I mean, it was a victory in the sense that that something that we needed to stop got slowed, right? And I think back, to sort of Ralph Nader's efforts to build alliances with Patrick Buchanan around the Seattle moment, and sort of some of the debates that happened around that, and sort of the discomfort in other cases that there was with that. I think the reality. So I think what that just illustrates, that example of sort of the politics against NAFTA, the FTAA, the World Trade Organization, in which you had the proto-Trumpists, right? The Patrick Buchanans and Trump himself were part of that. You know, in the 1990s, they had relatively little power within the Republican Party. The Republican Party was a liberal capitalist party, you know, in that period. And so it was largely, you know, the Democratic left that was that in which they were sort of hanging on and served some kind of legitimation function, right, against the liberals, both in the Democrats and Republicans. And I don't mean liberals. I mean, there's some good meanings to liberalism too. I don't want to use it just as a blanket. I'm a liberal in many respects. I think individuals matter. You know, I don't want a strong state that's telling us all what to do all the time, right? So, but we're talking about liberal capitalism here. So that happened, but then, yeah. So what happened with Trump is that the nationalists had succeeded in taking over the Republican Party, and they did the thing that they had always wanted to do, right? So, okay, that's good that, you know, that happened, but, you know, where are we headed now?
Yeah, right. And what's happening on March 11th, other than the anniversary of the 10-year anniversary of the tsunami in Japan, which is also happening on March 11th? But you're involved with a conference that's online. That's
it's a gathering. Yeah, I wouldn't go so far, but it's a good gathering, and everybody who's here should tune in and join it. So what we're doing on March 11th is we're bringing together some of the contributors to the special issue to talk about the movements at the millennium, this millennial period, these millennial turns that David and I have been talking about, and to look forward and to have the same conversation, except for it's not just me and David, but it's Norman Stockwell, publisher of the Progressive magazine, will be co-moderating that with Seren Mudliar, Bill Fletcher, who history with the Black Radical sort of tradition, the Black Radical Congress in the 90s, and also with organized labor, has been just incredibly influential and profound and deep thinker. We'll have, I believe, Shannon Gleason, who wrote about the immigrant rights movement for this special issue, Hilary Lazar, and let's see, who else? Leslie Wood, who I mentioned earlier. So it will be a good collection of people who were part of, the movement building projects in this period, but who are also scholars. And so what folks should do if you want to tune in is go to my website tomorrow. I noticed David put my I just saw that a registration page was put online at Socialism and Democracy. What I will do is later today, I will link to that so you can register for this online event on March 11th, which is at 7 p.m. Eastern, and join us for that conversation, to look back and then to look forward, see what we learned together. Because sometimes those conversations actually matter.
Yeah, and Bill Fletcher is a brilliant man, and I heard him speak at an event in the Midwest some years ago, and then I don't know if I'm the only one who gets confused by this, but there's a new book out on PM Press about Ben Fletcher.
His dad.
What?
I believe his dad.
Are they related?
I'm pretty sure he doesn't. I interviewed Bill for this special issue, actually, but he doesn't talk. He talks about his dad, but he doesn't mention his name. I believe that's his father. I'll have to double.
I would now I really need to know, because Ben Fletcher was an IWW organizer in Philadelphia on the shipyards in the early 20th century, and yeah, and if they're related, that would be fascinating. and their names are similar enough, and their backgrounds similar enough that when I hear them mentioned, I'm often confused, and I have to try to figure out which one we're talking about.
I've never asked Bill about that, but I believe somebody told me that. And of course, Bill was from Boston, and Ben was in Boston. So I mean, but so let's say that's an unconfirmed rumor at this point. But anyway, yes, Ben Fletcher also, of course, yeah, and I have that book too. I ordered a copy. I don't oftentimes do that, but I wanted that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned in this analysis online is around shortcomings in looking at institutional racism in the movement, and I wonder if you could talk about that a bit.
You're talking about in the 2000s period.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was more profound in some places than in others, right? I mean, you have the black rat. So I'm not going to. There's the black and white thing, right? It's not just black and white, but clearly the black radical tradition has been important throughout all of this. And the black radical tradition had, a resurgence in the 1990s, in part because of a deliberate project to rebuild it. And Bill talks about the way in which sort of the Million Man March and the Nation of Islam sort of compelled a lot of sort of, at that point, younger but still veteran activist intellectuals to build the Black Radical Congress, right? But it had some overlap with other things that were going on, but also its own roots. And of course, those roots overlap when you get back far enough, you find out, right? But if we're being, so there were a lot of critiques of the global justice movement, so-called, of sort of the progressive populist politics, the anti-corporate politics of this period, that were both internal and external critiques, right? I don't write about this in the introduction, in my part of the introduction here, but I and three other organizers put together something we called the Olympia Round meeting for the weekend right after Seattle. We were involved in the organizing for the Seattle uprising for months out, as were many people, and we knew that a lot of people that were going to be there really should have the opportunity to talk with each other and take the energy that we expected would come out of Seattle. We didn't know we were going to win in Seattle, but we knew something important was going to happen there. And so we organized a meeting just down the road in Olympia, Washington. So we called it the Olympia Round on Corporations, because the Seattle meeting is the Seattle Round for the GATT negotiations on the WTO. And it was a great meeting. We had a couple people who couldn't make it because they were still in jail, like Asante Riverwind. But actually large sections of the film The Corporation were shot there, right? But anyway, in terms of the point that I was trying to raise there is that I called us the four pink guys, right? Because these are four white men. I was pretty young at that point, but that's who we were. And that, so there was an awareness on the part of a lot of people who were coming out of predominantly white spaces that this was not, you couldn't build the democracy movement that was, majority white. That just was not going to happen, right? And there were external critiques, or really their internal, external critiques of the folks who were like sort of alienated, but also still part of the organizing. Around Seattle, why was Seattle so white? Well, it was actually less white than sometimes the media would give you the sense. It was, especially if you look at it in a global sense, but also in terms of the organizers in Seattle and Washington in particular, who made Seattle happen. But I guess the point being that a lot of people were aware, that this couldn't continue. So when I said earlier that I give a lot of credit to the Occupy folks, not all of them, but a lot of them, for the way in which I witnessed them go into helping to build, Black Lives Matter, to support Black Lives Matter, to ask, where can we help and step in. I give them credit. That's progress. That's a step forward from the 1990s.
Yeah. This when you talk about the months of preparation involved with Seattle, of course, I know, you and so many of the other folks involved with organizing it, and it was months long. Also, for that matter, the first protest in New York City at Occupy Wall Street was planned months in advance, and some of the organizers were some of the same people involved with the WTO protests. And I knew about it in advance because some of the same people who were organizing those protests let me know there's going to be something going on this day. But
we're all talking about it.
What's that?
We're all talking about it. What happened in New York? What's going to happen in DC with Occupy Freedom Plaza? And exactly. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
But the organizing, I think that one of the things that became a discussion that kind of got lost on a lot of folks afterwards was the difference between sort of what can happen when a meme becomes popular and spreads, and the kind of way that can take on a life of its own and allow all kinds of things to happen that might not otherwise happen. And the difference between that phenomenon and the phenomenon of just putting in a lot of effort into horizontal organizing, which is not the same thing, right? And can you talk about that distinction a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a good job of setting it out, and I think a lot of us, who I think you're only a little bit older than I am, you're an Xer, right?
I'm accused of being a boomer, but I think I'm too young to be. I'm 67, born in 67.
Yeah, you're way too young for that. So the thing is, I think a lot of us have been pretty careful to not come in heavy on younger activists and tell them what we think they're doing wrong or what they're doing wrong. And part of that, I think, is because a lot of us had the experience of older activists doing that to us, right? And also, horizontalism and anti-authoritarianism means you don't want to be the authority figure. But look, let's be clear. Some of us have had those conversations about what we saw happening in Wisconsin, in not across the board in Wisconsin, not across the board in Occupy, not across the board with Black Lives Matter, especially in the most recent wave, which expanded far beyond the Black Lives Matter organizing that had already been happening. So we've had conversations with each other, but let's come out and say it. You need to learn the things that you don't know how to do. You can call it a spokes council meeting, but that doesn't mean you really have practice with organizing a spokes council meeting. You can say you're doing horizontal organizing, but maybe you're not doing it very well. Maybe there, you say we're engaged in nonviolent direct action, but where are all the nonviolent direct action trainers? I mean, this is also a reason why it's important to look back to earlier periods, because there are things that we've lost. Not only are there resources that are still present in the sense of knowledge and practices and people, but there are things we've lost. It used to be the case that in any town of any size in the United States, at least in the North, and I think in much of the South, there were people who were free nonviolent direct action trainers. It's just that's what they did. They knew how to organize a nonviolent direct action training. They would do it, right? That has become an industry that people are expected to pay money for, right? It's just the point being that what you're saying about the form of something and then the substance of actually doing it. Yeah, we should pay attention to the difference between that, because if you look at some of the areas, some of the sort of cases in which some of the significant uprisings of the last 10 years have been demobilized, frankly, I don't think we would have been demobilized in the 1990s, by 2000 anyway, because it wouldn't have been possible. But it was possible to demobilize the Wisconsin uprising for a variety of reasons.
Interesting. That's very interesting. And having known you when you were young, Ben, I have to say that as far as any evidence that I ever saw of you having any kind of attitude towards older people lecturing about the 60s was a particular gentleman who seemed to think that smoking pot was going to solve the world's problems. And I do remember you taking offense quite understandably at his position that everybody smoking more pot was going to solve all the problems of the world. But I don't think you generally had a bad attitude towards the 60s generation.
No, I mean, I not generally, but some people would irritate me, but I always looked out for mentors, and Ben Mazzell I liked quite a bit, and he and I would get confused with each other.
Yeah, similar last names, both activists on the left.
Guys, maybe a little bit different looking, but not that.
Ben, it's been a pleasure talking with you, having you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for making time and for the invitation, to come on. And thanks for what you're doing, David. It's been amazing to see all the work that you've been able to put together in this difficult period. And it's valuable stuff.
Well, it's fun finally learning how to use a microphone and do live streaming without losing the connection and stuff like that. It took the pandemic for me to learn how to use a USB mic properly, but I'm glad I did. Take care, Ben. I'll talk to you soon. And thanks for joining us for this discussion with Ben Manski. And you can find out more about that discussion coming up online on March 11th at benmanski.com. But wait till tomorrow to look because it's not up there yet. And I will be here on whatever platform you're watching on. I'll be here tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern to do my last Saturday of the month concert online. And then I'll be back again on Sunday at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. GMT to talk with playwright, actor, and musician Tayo Aluko about his upcoming radio play about Paul Robeson's attempted concert in Peekskill and the Peekskill riots of 1949. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And remember, mutual aid will get us through. Trust your neighbors. Bye for now.